The sun had barely risen over the jagged horizon of the Arizona desert when the woman appeared, thin and weary, stumbling along the dusty trail that ran past the ranch. Her clothes, once bright, were now faded and torn, and her feet were blistered from walking long distances over the rough terrain. Her eyes, dark and haunting, told a story of sorrow that no words could capture. She was a widow from the Apache tribe, and the world she had known had vanished in an instant, leaving her alone in the vast wilderness. She had once had a family, a home filled with laughter and warmth, but all of that was gone. A violent raid had stolen them from her, leaving her with nothing but memories and a deep, aching grief. For days, she had wandered, unsure where to go or how to survive. She knew the desert was unforgiving, with its scorching days and freezing nights, but she had no choice. Each step she took was both an act of survival and a quiet prayer that she might somehow find help. As she neared the ranch, her strength began to fail. She had eaten very little over the past few days, relying only on wild berries and the occasional small catch from the sparse desert wildlife. Her body was weak, and her vision blurred as she struggled to keep moving. The ranch itself was a small but sturdy place, with wooden fences enclosing a few horses and cattle, and a modest house that had been built with hard work and determination. It was a place of refuge in the middle of a harsh landscape, and she hoped desperately that someone there might help her. The rancher, a tall, rugged man with a weathered face, had noticed her from the porch of his home. He had seen travelers pass by, but this woman was different. She was alone, her steps unsteady, and her eyes held a fear and sadness that he could not ignore. He watched her for a few moments, unsure whether she would make it to the gate or collapse before reaching it. Something in her desperate approach stirred a sense of responsibility in him, though he did not yet understand why. When she finally reached the edge of the ranch, she fell to her knees in the dust, gasping for air. Her voice was barely a whisper, broken and trembling, but the words carried the weight of her plea. "Take me as your wife, or let me die," she said, her tone filled with both desperation and courage. The rancher felt a shock run through him at her words. They were startling, bold, and raw. But they also revealed a will to live that he could not ignore. He stepped forward cautiously, unsure how to respond. In that moment, the desert seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them. The wind carried a dry, hot heat, and the sound of distant birds was the only noise around them. He noticed the dirt and bruises on her arms, the way her hands trembled as she reached out for help. He also saw a quiet dignity in her posture, despite the obvious weakness and suffering. She had endured much, and yet there was a strength in her that went beyond her fragile appearance. The rancher knelt down beside her, offering a hand. "You must be exhausted," he said gently. "Come inside. You can rest, and we will see what we can do." She hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his face, as if measuring whether he could be trusted. Then, slowly, she allowed him to lift her to her feet. Her legs wobbled under her weight, and he supported her carefully, guiding her toward the house. Inside, he helped her sit on a chair near the fireplace. The warmth of the room was a stark contrast to the harsh desert outside, and she shivered as the heat touched her chilled skin. He fetched a bowl of water and some bread, which she accepted with trembling hands. For a long time, she simply drank and ate in silence, her eyes fixed on the floor. The rancher watched her, sensing that her mind was far away, lost in memories too painful to speak of. After a while, she looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "I have nowhere to go," she said softly. "If you cannot take me in, I have nothing left. I will not survive out there." There was no demand in her voice, only a quiet plea. The rancher felt a mixture of emotions, pity, compassion, and a growing admiration for her bravery. She had faced unimaginable loss, yet she had found the courage to ask for help rather than giving in to despair. He decided that he could not let her die. Not when she had come this far. Not when she had shown such determination to live. But the choice he faced was not simple. Taking her in meant more than offering food and shelter. It meant risking the opinions of neighbors and breaking social norms of the time. Yet, he could not ignore the humanity in front of him. For the first time in many years, he felt the weight of a moral decision that went beyond daily survival and work. Over the next few days, he cared for her with quiet attention. He cleaned her wounds, gave her clothes to replace the tattered ones she had worn, and tended to her with a patience that surprised even him. She rested in a small room he had prepared, and he watched as her strength slowly returned. With each passing day, she spoke more, telling small stories of her family, her tribe, and the life she had once known. Her words were filled with sorrow, but also with wisdom and a deep understanding of the land she had grown up in. The rancher found himself drawn to her stories. They were unlike anything he had heard before, filled with lessons about survival, respect for nature, and the importance of community. He realized that she was not simply a woman in need. She was someone with knowledge and courage that could not be measured by the hardships she had endured. He began to respect her not only for her survival, but for the spirit she carried within her. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, the widow spoke quietly. "I do not ask for your love," she said. "I only ask to live. If I must remain alone, I will, but I cannot survive on my own." Her voice was steady now, no longer trembling with fear, but filled with determination. The rancher nodded, understanding her perfectly. He would not let her die. He would do everything in his power to ensure she survived, even if the world outside judged his actions. Days turned into weeks, and the widow slowly regained her strength. She began to help around the ranch, feeding the animals and tending to small tasks. The rancher noticed her skill and care, and he realized that her presence was becoming not only a matter of survival, but also a source of comfort and hope. In the harsh desert, where life was often cruel and unforgiving, they began to form an unspoken bond. Though neither of them could yet name it, there was a connection growing between them. It was built on trust, respect, and the quiet understanding that they had both survived losses that could have destroyed them. In the shadow of tragedy, they found a fragile hope that life could continue, and perhaps even thrive. The desert outside remained harsh and unyielding. But inside the small ranch house, a new story was beginning. One of survival, compassion, and the first fragile steps toward healing. And so, in that remote corner of the Arizona desert, a widow who had begged for life found a protector who refused to let her perish. Their journey was only beginning, and the hardships of the world were far from over. But for the first time in months, she felt safe. And for the rancher, who had long lived by rules of solitude and self-reliance, the arrival of the widow would mark the start of a chapter he had never imagined. A chapter defined by courage, compassion, and the unexpected bonds that sometimes arise in the most unlikely places. The days that followed were quiet but full of small discoveries. The rancher had never taken in anyone who was not a member of his family or a trusted worker. The arrival of the Apache widow challenged him in ways he did not fully understand. Every time he looked at her, he saw a mixture of vulnerability and quiet strength that was both humbling and inspiring. She had survived so much, yet she did not complain. Instead, she worked quietly and observed everything around her with keen eyes. The rancher could not help but notice the difference in their worlds. He had grown up knowing only the ranch, the routines of cattle, and the unforgiving desert. She had lived with her tribe, learning to read the land, care for animals in different ways, and respect the natural balance of life. Her skills and knowledge were unlike anything he had encountered. When she suggested ways to find water in dry areas or protect the livestock from predators, he began to see her as more than a survivor. she was a teacher in her own right. Despite their growing trust, the rancher still struggled with the idea of taking her in permanently. It was not just a question of his own feelings. He knew that neighbors and townsfolk might not understand. The world they lived in had rules and expectations, and he had spent much of his life following them. Marrying, or even keeping an Apache woman on his ranch, would be seen as unusual, even scandalous. And yet, the thought of leaving her to fend for herself in the harsh desert was impossible. Her life depended on his choice, and his heart refused to accept the thought of her dying. He spent hours thinking about what he could do. He watched her carefully, noting how she moved through the ranch with quiet grace, tending to the animals, repairing fences, and helping wherever she could. Each day, he saw her confidence grow, and he felt a mix of admiration and unease. He admired her courage and intelligence, but he also worried about the feelings stirring in his heart. He had always been a man of routine, of rules and work. And yet this woman had entered his life and changed the rhythm of everything. At night, they often sat near the fireplace, speaking softly. She told stories of her childhood, of the dances, ceremonies, and traditions of her people. Her words painted pictures of a world that was rich in culture and wisdom, a world that the rancher had never truly known. He listened with fascination, sometimes asking questions to understand better. She answered patiently, explaining the meaning behind her words. And he realized that she had much to teach him, not only about survival, but about life, respect, and resilience. There were moments, though, when the weight of their differences became clear. The rancher was a man of rules and structure, while she had lived a life of freedom and connection to the land. They argued gently at times over the best way to do things on the ranch. She suggested moving the cattle to graze near a creek she had noticed, while he argued that it was too far and dangerous. But slowly, he began to appreciate her perspective. Her knowledge of the land was remarkable, and he realized that his way was not the only way to care for the ranch. One afternoon, as the sun hung low and cast long shadows over the desert, a small incident tested their growing bond. A young calf had wandered off, frightened by a coyote in the distance. The rancher prepared to chase after it, but she stopped him gently. "Wait," she said. "Let me try first. I know how to guide it back without scaring it further." He watched, skeptical but curious, as she approached the frightened animal with calm, deliberate movements. Her voice was soft, almost like a song, and she extended her hand slowly. The calf paused, looking at her, then slowly followed her back to the corral. The rancher was amazed. He had always relied on his strength and speed, but she had used patience and understanding. It was a lesson he would not forget. And in that moment, he understood that she had a wisdom born not of fear, but of experience and empathy. As the weeks passed, their bond deepened. She helped with daily chores, but she also brought life to the ranch in ways the rancher had not expected. She taught him how to identify edible plants in the desert, how to track animals without disturbing them, and how to use herbs to treat minor injuries. He began to rely on her guidance, realizing that her presence was not just comforting, but essential. The ranch, once a place of solitary labor, began to feel alive with new energy. Yet, despite the growing closeness, the rancher continued to wrestle with his inner conflict. He had always been a man of logic and reason, but his heart now pulled him in directions he did not understand. He wondered if he could ever offer her more than shelter and friendship. He worried about what others might think, and yet he knew that leaving her to face the desert alone was unthinkable. Each day, the choice became clearer in his mind. He could either protect her and accept the consequences, or abandon her and risk the guilt that would haunt him forever. The widow, for her part, did not pressure him. She had come to the ranch seeking life, not marriage or companionship. Her gratitude was evident in small ways. A gentle smile, a helping hand, a quiet presence in the mornings as the ranch woke. She respected his space and routines, never overstepping boundaries. Yet, she also shared her world openly, allowing him to see her strength, her intelligence, and her resilience. Slowly, he began to admire her not just for surviving, but for living fully, despite the tragedies she had endured. One evening, as the sky turned shades of pink and orange, the rancher found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to his doorstep. He remembered the moment she had fallen at the edge of his property, her desperate plea echoing in his mind. "Take me as your wife, or let me die." At the time, the words had shocked him, but now he understood their meaning. She had been asking for life, for a chance to continue despite the losses she had suffered. And he had answered her plea, not out of obligation, but because he could not bear to let her die. Their days continued with small victories and challenges. They repaired fences together, tended to the animals, and shared meals by the fireplace. In these ordinary moments, trust grew between them. She learned to rely on him, and he learned to rely on her. The desert, which had once been a place of danger and isolation for her, began to feel safer, warmer, and even familiar. And for the rancher, who had always been a solitary figure, the presence of another human being, someone so different, yet so remarkable, brought a new sense of purpose and meaning. Despite the growing closeness, there was still a distance between them, shaped by the world outside the ranch. He worried about what the neighbors might say, about the opinions of people who would never understand her story or his choice. She, in turn, understood the delicate balance between gratitude and independence. She had been through so much, and she refused to be seen as a burden. Instead, she offered her skills, her knowledge, and her quiet companionship, leaving him to navigate his own feelings. In the quiet moments of the night, he found himself thinking about her more often than he expected. Her resilience, her courage, and her wisdom had touched him deeply. He admired the way she faced each day with determination, refusing to be defeated by the harshness of life. And slowly, without realizing it, he began to see her not just as someone to protect, but as someone who had become essential to his own life. The moral struggle within him was not over. He knew that taking her in permanently, perhaps even marrying her, would be judged by others. It went against the expectations of the time and the world he had always known. And yet, he could not ignore the truth he felt in his heart. She was no longer just a woman in need. She was a person whose presence had transformed his life, whose courage and intelligence had earned his respect, and whose spirit had awakened feelings he could not easily name. By the end of the weeks, a quiet understanding had formed between them. They worked together, laughed together, and faced the small challenges of ranch life as a team. The rancher realized that life with her was richer and more meaningful than he could have imagined. And the widow, for her part, had found safety, respect, and a sense of belonging in a world that had once seemed so cruel and unforgiving. In the harsh Arizona desert, where survival often depended on strength and independence, the two of them had found a connection built on trust, compassion, and mutual respect. The rancher had faced a moral choice that challenged his beliefs and his sense of duty. And he had chosen to protect life, even at the risk of judgment and uncertainty. The widow had shown that courage and determination could overcome even the darkest moments. Together, they had begun a new chapter, one that promised hope, understanding, and the possibility of a life shaped not by tragedy alone, but by the strength of the human spirit. Life on the ranch settled into a steady rhythm. But it was a rhythm filled with discovery, small triumphs, and shared challenges. The Apache widow had regained her strength, and each day she moved more confidently among the animals, the fences, and the fields. The rancher watched her with quiet admiration, amazed by how skillfully she handled tasks that had once been difficult even for him. Her knowledge of the land, the animals, and the changing weather seemed almost instinctive. One morning, a gentle breeze swept through the ranch, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dry earth. The widow led the rancher to a hidden spring she had noticed while exploring the land. The water was clear and cool, and it promised to be a steady source of hydration for both the ranch animals and themselves. "If we use it carefully," she said, "it can last even through the driest season." The rancher was impressed. He had walked this land for years, but she saw things he had never noticed. Her presence was not only helpful, it was changing how he understood the desert itself. The rancher and the widow began working together on ways to improve the ranch. She taught him techniques she had learned from her tribe, like ways to protect crops from pests without harming the animals, and how to build small shelters that provided shade for the livestock during scorching afternoons. At first, he had been skeptical, but as they tried her methods, he realized they were not only effective, but also thoughtful, showing a deep understanding of nature's balance. He began to admire her even more, not just for her survival skills, but for her wisdom and care for every living thing around them. As they worked, they shared stories. She told him about her childhood in the Apache community, about dances that lasted through the night, about songs and ceremonies that celebrated life and family. She spoke of her parents and siblings with love, even as her voice carried the weight of loss. The rancher, in turn, told her about his life on the ranch, about the early mornings, the long days, and the quiet moments of satisfaction when the animals were healthy and the fences held strong. Through these conversations, they learned not only about each other's skills, but about their hearts, their values, and the experiences that had shaped them. Their bond grew in ways neither had expected. There were quiet moments of laughter, when an animal misbehaved, or when a task did not go as planned. There were evenings when they sat by the fireplace, sharing simple meals and reflecting on the day. She had once been a woman seeking only survival, but now she had a sense of belonging, and the rancher, who had always been solitary, began to feel a companionship that he had never experienced before. Their friendship was built on trust, respect, and a growing understanding of each other's strengths. One day, a storm rolled in from the west. The sky darkened, and the wind howled through the desert, bending the trees and tossing dust into the air. The animals grew restless, and the rancher and the widow worked together to secure the ranch. She guided the horses into sheltered areas, helped bring the cattle closer to safety, and even reinforced weak spots in the fences. Her calm and steady approach kept both the animals and the rancher focused and safe. He realized in that moment that her courage was not the loud, dramatic kind, but a quiet strength that could withstand even the harshest storms. After the storm passed, the rancher looked around at the ranch and the widow, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The land had been harsh, unforgiving, and sometimes lonely, but with her by his side, he felt prepared to face whatever challenges came next. He began to see that life was richer when shared, and that strength was not only in working alone but in trusting and relying on another person. The widow's presence had transformed his understanding of both the land and himself. As the seasons changed, so did the relationship between the rancher and the widow. They began to anticipate each other's needs, often working in silence with a shared understanding. She would prepare meals with ingredients she had foraged from the desert, while he would repair fences and handle the livestock. Their teamwork made the ranch run more smoothly than it had in years, and the sense of cooperation brought a new energy to the place. It was not simply that she was helping him. Together, they were creating something stronger and more sustainable than either could have achieved alone. There were also moments that tested their patience and understanding. The desert was unpredictable, and not every plan succeeded. Sometimes an animal would wander off, sometimes a fence would break during a windstorm, and sometimes their ideas about the best approach would clash. But even in these moments, they learned from each other. He began to appreciate her insight and adaptability, and she respected his experience and careful planning. These challenges became opportunities to deepen their bond, to build trust, and to recognize the value of combining their skills. One afternoon, a young colt became trapped in a small ravine near the edge of the ranch. The rancher tried to reach it, but the slope was steep and dangerous. She stepped forward calmly, assessing the situation. With careful movements, she guided the frightened colt, speaking softly and using gestures to encourage it to climb to safety. The rancher watched, amazed at her patience and understanding of the animal. When the colt finally reached the top, both of them breathed a sigh of relief. The rancher realized again that her bravery was quiet but unshakable, a courage that inspired and reassured everyone around her. As they spent more time together, their conversations grew deeper. She spoke of the hardships she had endured, of the loss of her family, and the challenges she had faced alone in the desert. He listened with empathy, never judging, only offering support when she asked for it. In return, he shared his own experiences of loneliness, responsibility, and the burden of running the ranch. Through these exchanges, they found a mutual respect that went beyond words, a silent understanding that they could rely on each other, not just for work, but for comfort, companionship, and trust. The widow's influence on the rancher was subtle, but profound. He began to notice the way he thought about the future, not just as a solitary man managing a piece of land, but as someone responsible for another person's well-being and happiness. He realized that life was not just about survival and hard work. It was about connection, kindness, and shared purpose. And for the widow, he had become more than a protector. He was someone she could trust, someone who treated her with respect, and someone who recognized her strength rather than fearing her differences. In the quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done and the sky was painted with stars, they would sometimes sit together outside the house. The desert stretched endlessly before them, silent except for the distant sounds of nocturnal creatures. She would point out constellations and tell stories of their meanings from her culture. And he would listen, fascinated by the depth of her knowledge and the beauty of her perspective. These moments, filled with peace and shared understanding, became some of the most meaningful in both their lives. Through all these experiences, a deep sense of partnership emerged. They were no longer simply two people coexisting on the ranch. They had become a team, relying on each other's strengths and learning from each other's wisdom. The widow's courage, knowledge, and resilience had brought life and hope to a place that had once been isolated and solitary. The rancher, in turn, had provided protection, guidance, and a sense of stability that allowed her to rebuild her life. Together, they were stronger, more capable, and more connected than they could have been alone. The desert, with all its challenges, had become a place of growth and discovery. The rancher had learned patience, humility, and the importance of trust. The widow had found safety, respect, and a sense of purpose. And together, they were creating a life that balanced work, survival, and companionship. It was a life shaped by courage, resilience, and the quiet power of two people who had faced loss and hardship but had chosen to move forward together. By the end of the season, it was clear that neither could imagine life without the other. The ranch had survived storms, predators, and the challenges of the harsh environment, thanks to their combined efforts. And more importantly, they had survived the personal storms of grief, loneliness, and fear, finding in each other a source of strength and hope. The widow no longer needed to plead for life. She had claimed it fully, with dignity, courage, and determination. And the rancher had discovered a capacity for compassion, trust, and partnership that he had never known before. In this way, life on the ranch became more than a struggle for survival. It became a story of courage, resilience, and the unexpected bonds that can form between two people from very different worlds. The widow's presence had transformed the rancher's life, and the rancher's protection and trust had given her the chance to thrive once more. Together, they faced the desert with a sense of purpose, hope, and understanding, proving that courage, compassion, and respect could overcome even the harshest circumstances. The days began to stretch longer as summer approached, and the desert, though unforgiving, had become a place of quiet peace. The rancher and the widow worked together in harmony, their routine now so intertwined that each task felt like a natural part of their shared life. The bond they had formed was not just one of survival, but of understanding, respect, and mutual admiration. They had learned to read each other's needs without words, each gesture and glance speaking volumes. The rancher had long lived alone, finding solace in solitude. He had built his life on independence, relying on his own strength and resourcefulness. But with the widow by his side, he began to realize how much he had missed the company of another person. She had brought a richness to his life that he hadn't even known was missing. Her knowledge of the land, her patience with the animals, and her quiet strength had transformed the ranch. He had started out simply trying to save her life. But somewhere along the way, he had found his own life changed, deepened, more purposeful, and more connected. For the widow, life on the ranch had brought unexpected healing. The grief and pain of losing her family had not disappeared, but she had found a new reason to live. The rancher's kindness had given her a second chance, not just at survival but at life. She had found a place where she was needed and respected, where she could once again contribute to the land, the animals, and the man who had offered her a place of refuge. And, in the process, she had found a partner who valued her for who she was, not for the tragedy she had endured. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day's work, the rancher found himself thinking about how much had changed since the widow had come to his door. She had arrived broken, lost, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate plea for help. Now, she was a vital part of his life, someone whose presence filled the ranch with energy and purpose. He had come to rely on her, not only for practical help but for something deeper, something that went beyond the work they did together. It was the unspoken connection between them that had grown stronger over time, something that he could no longer ignore. He didn't know exactly when it happened, but he realized that he had come to care for her in a way that was more than simple gratitude or duty. It wasn't just about helping her survive anymore. It was about wanting her to thrive, wanting her to feel at home, wanting to be with her. He found himself wondering what the future might look like, not as a solitary rancher, but as someone who shared his life with another. The idea was both exciting and terrifying, a step into unknown territory, but one he felt ready to take. One afternoon, as they were walking to the corral, the rancher stopped and turned to face the widow. She had been talking about a new way to treat a sick cow, her voice steady and sure, but he noticed the quiet determination in her eyes as she spoke. The wind stirred her hair, and the soft light of the late afternoon made her seem almost ethereal. He felt a sudden rush of emotion, a desire to speak the words that had been on his mind for weeks but had never found their way to his lips. He took a deep breath, his voice slightly rough. "I never thought I'd say this, but I can't imagine this ranch without you. You've made it, more than I ever thought it could be." The widow stopped in her tracks, her expression softening as she met his gaze. There was a pause, a moment where time seemed to slow down, and then she spoke, her voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "I never imagined that I would find a place like this again, either. A place where I could belong, where I could be part of something. You've given me more than just shelter, you've given me a chance." The rancher's heart swelled with emotion. He had never expected this, never imagined that the woman who had come to him broken and desperate would become such an integral part of his life. He had hoped to save her, but in the process, she had saved him too, in ways he couldn't fully explain. They had both healed in each other's company, and now, the idea of continuing this life, together, felt more right than anything he had ever known. The winds began to pick up, and the sky grew darker as the first stars began to appear. It was a quiet moment, the kind of moment that seemed to hold more weight than words could describe. He stepped closer to her, his heart racing as he spoke again, this time with more certainty. "I don't want to live this life alone anymore. I've never asked anyone to stay with me before, but I can't imagine it without you. I want you to stay for good. You've become more than just a partner on this ranch. You've become someone I can't imagine being without." The widow's eyes softened, and for a long moment, she said nothing. Her gaze drifted to the sky, then back to him, and in that look, he saw something that made his heart race even more: a quiet understanding, an unspoken agreement that she, too, felt the same. She nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I never thought I would have a chance to build something like this again. You've given me that. And I want to stay, too." In that moment, the rancher felt a weight lift from his chest. It was as if a part of him he hadn't even known was missing had been filled. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges, as there always were in the desert, but he also knew that he wasn't alone anymore. He had found a partner, a woman whose strength, wisdom, and courage had not only saved her life, but had transformed his world. The days that followed were filled with a quiet sense of completion. The rancher and the widow worked side by side, their efforts more focused, more united than ever before. The ranch began to thrive in ways they hadn't thought possible. The animals were healthier, the land more productive, and the work, though just as hard as before, felt lighter somehow, as if they were no longer carrying it alone. Neighbors began to take notice. They had seen the widow working alongside the rancher, helping him, contributing to the success of the ranch. Slowly, the whispers faded, replaced by a new kind of respect. The widow was no longer just the woman who had come to him for help. She was an integral part of the ranch, a woman whose skills and knowledge were now seen as invaluable. The rancher, for his part, never let the opinions of others dictate his choices. He had made his decision, and he stood by it. He had chosen to help her, and in doing so, had found a strength and connection he hadn't even known he was missing. Months passed, and the seasons turned. The widow, once a stranger to the land, had come to know it as well as the rancher. Together, they had turned the ranch into a place of life, hope, and renewal. The harsh desert, once a place of fear and isolation, had become a home they had built together. The rancher no longer felt the weight of solitude, and the widow, once adrift in a world of loss and grief, had found a new family, a new purpose, and a new life. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, the rancher turned to her, his voice quiet but filled with meaning. "You saved me. I thought I was just saving you, but it was you who saved me." The widow smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "We saved each other." And so, in the heart of the desert, where life had once seemed fragile and fleeting, two people who had lost everything found everything again, not in material wealth or possessions, but in the deep bond they had formed. Together, they had created something far greater than survival. They had built a life rooted in respect, love, and the kind of quiet understanding that can only be forged through shared hardship and shared triumphs. It wasn't a perfect life, and it never would be. The desert was still unforgiving, the days still long, and the nights still cold. But with each other, they had found a strength that could not be shaken. And in that, they had built something far more enduring than the land itself. Something that would last long after the seasons changed, long after the winds had swept across the desert, and long after the sun had set on their shared journey.